So just a few house rules. Please keep your mic on to minimize background noise. No need to raise your hand. Go ahead and just unmute yourself if you have any questions or comments. And if you have a copy of the purchase contract in front of you, it's always good to have a hard copy so that you can, scratch it up, make notes on it, and use it as reference. So we always talk about the 6 duties that we owe to a client. And if you think about the 6 duties that we have that determine what is our fiduciary to a client, this will help to remind you. And some of you will still remember this from pre-licensing. And the acronym is COLD AC. So we'll go through it real quickly. So CARE, that's the first C in COLD AC, which is we have to make sure that we pay attention to the job and make sure that we avoid any damages to the client. A lot of times it's unintended consequences, but just being cognizant of what you're doing and saying and sharing will help you in terms of protecting your client. To act on. Hello?
Jen, sorry to interrupt you.
No problem.
Kurt cannot hear you. Do you have any suggestion?
Can you hear me, or
he cannot hear us?
So what he may have to do is initialize his voice again, or sometimes jump out of the world and jump back in. We do get glitches, like if you're coming from another room or another part of the EXP world and then you jump into ours, you might end up having some audio issues. Let me pull my screen over. It's going to get a little busy. I apologize. But right over here, you see that icon, the settings. So you want to make sure that your audio settings are correct. And if that is correct, you also want to check this where it says initialize your voice. Reset audio setting, and sometimes that helps. And if you still are having issues, you want to go into your settings for your sound, and just to make sure that any Bluetooth devices that you have that you're using are connected, so like your audio, and also your system for your sound is where it should be, because sometimes you might be in the EXP world and what shows up when you hit this gear icon isn't necessarily what's showing up over here. And I've had that happen to me too. So for me, let me move my screen over. Alrighty. So going back to the obedience, which is to act honestly, fairly, and in good faith, and obeying the client's lawful instructions. So again, if the client is instructing you to do something that is illegal, unlawful, or unethical, understand that you are not obligated. But it is a time to have a conversation with the client and maybe let them know like why you can't do what they're doing. If they still insist, then you have to walk away. So to place the client's interest to place the client's interest above your own, respective of the law. Disclosure, to keep the client informed of all facts and information that could impact the client. So part of this is also reminding them of the information that you're sending to them and to read it. Accounting, keeping records and making sure that you have the ability to report the status of all funds producing receipts on behalf of the client, and not to disclose any of the client's affairs unless they allow you to. So that's your confidentiality. So again, COLD AC, care, obedience, loyalty, disclosure, accounting, and confidentiality. So whenever you have a question of, is this something I should do? Is something I can do? Because it usually comes to a should you or could you question. Could you? Maybe. Should you? Maybe not. All right. Let me go ahead and close this one out. I think we're done with C. And I'm going to now bring in the purchase contract. And by the way, sometimes you'll get this. See that warning, unable to connect? So if you do get that again, so I can also reinitialize. We're finishing up section I, and we are talking about how this relates to also your J1, which actually refers to section I. In addition, your section I has to do with also any other reports that you get. So that falls under section G and F, and section L and section K. So your section I, while it is a separate area of disclosure, it's got a lot of threads and it connects to other parts of the purchase contract. And that's why it's important to know your contract as a whole. To be able to go through the contract and say, if I have an issue with this particular provision, is there another provision in the contract that I should be looking at and be made aware of, to make my client aware of, and also be able to use it for strategy reasons. So part of what your general disclosures are over here, I would like you to also understand that we do have some other forms in SkySlope that you could potentially use when you're giving certain disclosures, or if a client is waiving a contingency. Because if they waive a contingency and they say, I don't want this, I don't need that, and then later on something comes up, you want to protect yourself. The reason why EXP doesn't have a huge library of forms is because there's two thoughts when it comes to forms. One school of thought is have a form for everything. Protect yourself at every step of the way. The other school of thought is if your practice is to have a form for everything, when you don't have a form for that one other specific item, then that will harm you. So it's better to have more broad forms, and if needed, to have specific documentation, to do it by way of an email, because we live in a digital world. So before you have a client sign something via DigiSign, DocuSign, or even AuthenticSign or .loop or whatever it is that you folks use, I recommend that you always send the document by way of a separate PDF. Ask the client to and you'll be signing off of. Keep that email communication and make sure that you CC your SkySlope file email address so that it's collected in there and you don't have to worry about it later. Can you, okay,
There you are.
Okay.
You can hear us now.
can you hear me?
Hear us now?
No, I only hear you.
Oh, on the phone.
Yeah.
Okay. But I see you. Okay, now I see you. Let me check. Can
Yeah.
you turn your mic? I think I can hear Jennifer from you.
Yeah, I see you, Kurt, in here.
This is what I'm hearing right now.
Can you turn off your mic?
My mic is
Your
on.
mic is off.
Okay, so going back to here, what I'd like to show you also is that there are these disclosures, and most of the time we just tend to gloss them over and say, here are some general disclosures, but it is important to point them out at least by topic to your client the first time you're going over the purchase contract with them. Depending on the client, you may spend 30 minutes with them, you might spend an hour, which is pretty average, and sometimes you might spend 4 hours, and just because certain clients are like that. If it takes 4 hours, keep notes of what they're asking about, and it may come down to being able to have a more pointed discussion of, okay, what is it about this information that is important to you? What is it about this information that's concerning to you? What is it about this particular information or this provision that is confusing? You know, how can I help to make you better understand? Always come from a place of curiosity, you know, because that's actually going to help you to drill down to what really is important to the client and what kind of information that you may want to focus on in terms of giving them some highlights or drilling down to details. By the way, for the SRPDS that came out earlier this year, they do have that flood shoreline sea level rise, for shoreline erosion sea level rise. So just keep that in mind. It's not necessarily the same as being in a flood zone. You could be in a flood, you could not be in a flood zone and still be impacted to sea level rise. I'm going to go real quick while we're looking
Sorry,
at.
Jen?
Yes.
Can you repeat what you just said?
Oh yes, the SRPDS that was released earlier this year had a new addition to the SRPDS, and what it was is, and well, it's supposed to have been revised earlier this year. I know we have some other forms coming out in November. So again, take a look at the new forms, but the legislation passed a law this past session. And what it said was, so you may have not seen it in the February one, so be prepared when it comes down in November. But the legislation made a law change regarding the SRPDS 508D requirement that the seller must provide information to the buyer regarding not only the flood zone information, but any shoreline and sea level rise information as well. And each county and the state has worked together in terms of a website where the client would go and get that information, and it's based on TMK. You know, that was our pushback from HER's position is if you want us to disclose something, you have to be able to be held accountable on a state level and county level to provide that information to the seller. We as realtors cannot be the ones who are controlling this information if the information is based on the government providing these services and making these requirements. So make sure that your client looks at this, because again, your property may not be within a flood zone area, but that doesn't mean it's not being, that doesn't mean that it won't be impacted by sea level rise. Sea level rise and shoreline erosion are two different things. So shoreline erosion is those coastal areas where, the water is going in and out of the shoreline, taking away sand, eroding the coastal areas, eroding the shoreline. Sea level rise comes from the bottom up. So there are areas, especially living on an island, regardless of what island you live on, where you're going to have those lava tubes, right? And so there's ability of water infiltrating from the bottom going up into the land area. So for instance, because I'm on Oahu, I'm more familiar with Oahu. And if you go to the North Shore areas, especially Hauula, Punaluu, Ha'ava, all of those areas that are pretty notorious for like the road falling off the shore into the side, that whole area in 40 years is pretty much going to be marshland. So your client has to be aware of that. That you might be 2 miles out, but that doesn't mean that sea level rise isn't going to impact your property. If you live in anywhere that is near a beach, again, you could be 2-3 miles out from the beach, but that does not mean that your property won't be impacted by water infiltrating coming up from the ground and causing, soil settlement issues. So just be aware of that. We want to pull up a couple forms here. So I'm sorry, Ava, you had a question in here, and I don't know if I answered it, that says what kind of land? So I think I said marshland. Is that what you were keying in on?
Yes, marshland. Okay, because I've never heard this word, so sorry for my ignorance here.
No, so marshland is basically like it's not a swamp, but it is basically where it's water. It's water logged land. So, for instance, if you're on Oahu and you're familiar with Enchanted Lake area in Kailua, and it's called they call it Enchanted Lake, but it's really the Ke'eleulu Pond. That's actually marshland. It's not really a pond. It's a marshland. So you can build on marshland if you fill it, but at the same time, especially with EPA and type of DLNR issues, you can't do things like you used to be able to do. But all of that whole area of Enchanted Lake used to be just marshland, and they filled it in, and that's why it looks the way it does. And that's why it doesn't have a natural ingress or egress of water flow, just like with the Alawai Canal here. And again, I'm just bringing up Oahu because I'm just familiar with Oahu. If you're on an outer island, but and you're not on Oahu and you have information, please feel free to share because it's good for everybody else to know some history. But with Ke'eleulu Pond, the Army Reserve actually controls a lot of the waterways, which is why they would get involved with projects, with these state or county projects, because they actually regulate a lot of the berms and the water ingress egress. And like certain areas like Wailea, which is North Shore, you've got Ke'eleulu Pond in Kailua, you've got Alawai Canal in Waikiki. All of these areas, they have to work with the Army Reserve to open up the berms and allow water to flow in and out. Otherwise, it's just stagnant water. And that's where you get a lot of the issues with, bacteria and stuff like that.
Uh-huh.
I'm gonna go into SkyScope real quick, and I'm gonna show that on my screen here in a minute, just so that you can see some of the working docs. Okay, so I'm pulling this up. I'm gonna go into working docs, and I'm gonna go into Office Docs. So if you are not very familiar with all the forms that we have, I would like you to take a time to go through these Office Docs and through these folders and familiarize yourself. So if I go to Hawaii. I went to the Hawaii folder. And in the Hawaii folder, there's different counties. But really, every form is in the Hawaii folder. So regardless of which island you live on, every form is in the Hawaii folder. You can also click on document name. And what it does is it actually does it by alphabetical order. In this case, if you click on it, it'll show numeric and then alpha. And we have 5 pages. I'm going to go a little bit backwards because what I'd like to show you is this one. If you're not familiar with this one, because we did update our forms library a couple months ago, this has to do with vacant land. And I would use this for any improvement of land, even if it's vacant or not. Meaning that there is a dwelling or there isn't a dwelling, or somebody's looking to purchase a property and there are some sort of dilapidations or improvements. And the reason why I would still say this particular addendum, because it's an additional way of disclosing to the client that they have to understand that the property that they're purchasing, whether it's vacant or not, and again, this could just be internal. It doesn't have to be submitted to the other side. You can also just use this as consultation, and to let them know that not only is the property vacant, but there are things that may or may not be disclosed. There are things that may or may not be attached. Those are encumbrances. And does anybody know what an encumbrance is? And just throw a guess out there. Everybody's too shy. You can hear me, right? I'm sure you can hear. Okay. An encumbrance is something that is attached to the property, and it could be a right of way, it could be a mortgage lien, it could be CCNRs. So basically, an encumbrance is a right that's attached to the property or a lien that's attached to the property that may be beneficial or detrimental, but it impacts the property. It impacts perhaps certain use. It could impact what you can and cannot build. It can impact who owns the property as well, and what that owner can do as far as leveraging the property. And then you have appurtenances, which is very similar, but different. So what is an appurtenance? Anybody want to throw it out there?
Can I try?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. An apartment is a living quarter inside a multi-unit complex. A residential living quarter inside a multi-unit complex. Am I correct? Or close?
Yeah, you're close. You're close. So an appurtenance is something that's attached to a property, and that could be a right, or it could be even a physical item. So let's say parking stalls. Parking stalls would be deemed like an appurtenance. A right to use a physical space would be an appurtenance, something that is attached to the property that the owner has exclusive right to use, and that exclusive right to use could be in terms of only them or only those that are members of the association. So as owners, so for you, Peter, as you mentioned, like an apartment, right, complex, it could be, well, you have certain appurtenances, which is you have right to get onto the property, you have right to your specific parking stall, you have right to use your specific unit and the limited common elements that are attached to it. So encumbrances are usually seen things that are more attached that could prevent you from using something or doing something or restricting you, and appurtenance is more of a benefit if you want to break it down to that kind of level. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Would it be possible to look at encumbrance as having more of a legal right aspect to it rather than like a physical attachment?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it too. Absolutely. You know, but an encumbrance could be something that you don't see all the time either, right? So in terms of like you have CCNRs, those are attached to your property, and what you can and cannot do could be again could be a legal issue. You know, if somebody does something they're not supposed to. Certain ramifications. A mortgage, again, a financial legal document, that would be something. All of those things. So usually, if you look at it as an appurtenance is something that benefits that you have a right to use that's attached to the property. An encumbrance, yes, is typically something that would be detrimental or be somehow binding on someone.
I
Just
think
like
we used to, I think for nomenclature, we used to say it runs with the property, try to avoid attachment, which seems to have more of a physical implication possibly.
Yeah, they're very similar, but you know, let's say, so for example, if you're gonna say an easement, right? Is an easement an encumbrance or is it an appurtenance? Both run with the land, both run with the property.
I see it more as an encumbrance
So why would it be an encumbrance?
because the government has, or property owner, whatever, has a legal right to access the property in some way.
So let's talk about the flag lots, right? This is a good conversation. Thank you. I love the engagement, and this is what we do. This is why we don't record these classes, because it's pretty open, right? Conversation. So a flag lot. Let's say I own the property in the front, and you own the property in the back. So what would be the difference between a flag lot that versus a property that is landlocked but has an ingress egress easement on it? So I'm A, I'm in the front, you're B, you're in the back.
So if it's a flag lot where I own the land as the property owner in the back, that's actually part of the lot description, right? And, then easement would be more of an encumbrance on you, that I still have access to it, even though you own the land. I have a right of access to it. So your property is encumbered by my easement.
Yes, but you as C, is it a benefit to you?
It is a benefit to me. So are you saying that would be an appurtenance to me?
That would be more of an appurtenance to you, yes.
Okay, good illustration.
Yeah. So again, it's very similar, right? Because it's a matter of, you know, how do you look at it? From what perspective? So when you deal with clients, you want to explain to them these things, right? What is burdening your property and what is benefiting you as an owner of a property? So when we get into the survey section and we talk about encroachment and getting easements, or not easements, but encroachment agreement, you know, some people think, oh, automatically you should get an encroachment agreement. But again, is it an encumbrance or is it an appurtenance in terms of, you know, is it something that binds the owner and prevents them from using the use of the land to the full benefit? Or does it benefit the owner? Depends on who's encroaching on who, right? Not everybody wants to have an encroachment agreement depending on who's buying the property and who's encroaching. Part of all of these things that we talk about is really to have that conversation with the client. Don't assume that every client has the same concern. Don't presume that they understand, you know, what it is that you're talking about. For those of you who have worked with, you know, you've all worked with clients. Have you ever looked at a client and thought, are they really understand what I'm saying to them?
All the time.
Yeah, are they just nodding their head and going, because they're thinking, oh, you know what, I'm kind of ashamed I don't know this, and they're a little embarrassed, right, to ask. And I get this too from those that are, actually get it from those that are highly educated. They'll either be very vocal or they'll be very quiet. Because it's almost like, should I know this? Should I not know this? And then they'll come back later and start kind of questioning you a little more aggressively. At least that's my experience. Because they really started to think about it. Those that are not as educated in the contracts and understanding legal terms, they'll just kind of accept it. But it doesn't mean that they're happy. So know who your audience is. It's not about a level of intelligence. It's not what I'm trying to say. It's more about how educated they are about the process. You know, if they're educated about the process, they might just go, okay, and then think about it later and go, wait, did I understand it correctly? And if they're not educated about the process, they'll just kind of go, well, I don't know, my client just told me to sign something, or my agent just told me to sign something, and I did. They weren't aware that they should be or allowed to even ask questions. So make sure that when you're speaking with your clients, that you have that open door policy to say, if you have any questions, let me know. I want to make sure that you're okay with everything moving forward. And this is part of those conversations to say, I don't know everything as an agent. You may have to seek an attorney. You may have to seek a surveyor. You may have to go to DTP. You may have to go to an architect. You may have to see whoever it is that you have to see to understand what you can and cannot do. And that there may be some attachments to the property that are not physical, you know, and that's when it talks about any rights, appurtenances, easements, encroachments that may encumber the property or impact or limit the ability to improve the property. So again, make sure that you have that conversation. And again, this is one way to do it, so that if they come back later and say, remember we had this conversation, and you know, I wanted to make sure you understood, so we had this document signed. And include that in your email too. You know, as we discussed, your concerns about yada, yada, yada. I'm not, you know, I'm a real estate professional, but I'm not a professional that can counsel you in the areas that you have concerns about. Okay. Any other comments or questions? Anything you want to share? I love that you guys are so engaged. Here's another one. Waiver of liability form. Has any of you ever seen this one? Or used it in the past? So how about the one that has to do with staking and survey waiver?
Yes, just used it yesterday.
Yeah. So we have this one, and it's very specific, right? Staking and surveying. But we also have, and then we have one that's for J1 waiver. We have one that's sight unseen. And then this one, which is the waiver of liability. Again, this is not something that needs to be attached to the contract. It can be, but this is really more of an internal form. And again, you know, the main thing that we want to emphasize is if a client says, I'm willing to waive all these contingencies because I want my offer to be the most aggressive and I want to get it accepted, that they understand that by waiving certain contingencies, that there could be an unintentional consequence of harm to them. And this gives you the ability to say, okay, for, you know, waiver of liabilities, and it could be whatever, contingencies, inspections, it could be generic, it could be specific. And then it says, from any liability in my decision too. And again, you can point this out and list as specific or general as you'd like. It does not require a broker signature, but if you have any questions regarding a form that you're not sure of how to use, or if it's a or if it is appropriate to use, please seek out either your team leader or your broker, or your team leader / broker. I just wanted to show a few of those for you, disclosures. And by the way, what are the two biggest topics when it comes to litigations and claims? If you had to say, okay, if I'm going to be involved in a lawsuit or have a lawsuit or a claim made against me, what are the two issues or the two topics that are the most common?
I would say disclosure and ethics.
Yep, disclosure, ethics. When you say ethics, that would probably fall more in line with a HAR, NAR, or a local county association. When it comes to other principals or parties in a contract, disclosure, absolutely. What would be the other one?
Lack of documentation.
Yep, lack of documentation is important. And it's not on this page, by the way. It's in the contract, but it's not in this page. How about agency? Agency is a disclosure, and agency and clients not understanding agency or not being explained agency and disclosures are the two top litigation topics when it comes to realtors. So just keep that in mind. That's why your disclosures are on the front page when it comes to agency. And that's why when you do a dual agency, that should be signed first before anything else. And by the way, the reason why we also want to make sure that wired funds addendum is in the contract, because a lot of people think, well, what's the big deal? Why do we have to have the EFT wire fraud disclosure in our contract? In the last 5 years, wire fraud has gone up 35%, according to national statistics from escrow companies. It's pretty huge, right? Wire fraud is still on the rise. There was a recent one too. It's almost a $2 million problem. A client, not with us, but it was a client who almost sent in a $2 million funds over to escrow, and smartly, prior to hitting the authorization button, they reached out to the escrow officer. Lo and behold, it was not something they sent out. It was fraudulent, but it was so convincing. So that's why we still want that wire fraud in there, because it is still prevalent and it's on the rise. And we just have to make sure that they don't miss it because it gets lost in the section of the contract. Okay. Now we're getting to J1. And how fun is J1? How fun is this section? So let me ask you, in this market, when it comes to property inspection, what are you guys putting in terms of time frame for your client to do an inspection?
May I answer?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. I think it depends on the length of escrow. If it's 30 days, I will use 30 days. I would choose between 7 to 10 days, but most likely 10 days because 7 days is really short. Yeah, you might not be able to make it to the inspection and talk with your clients. So 10 days I think would be reasonable for a 30-day escrow. For 45 days, you can request up to 14 days. It depends on if the seller agrees. So 14 days for 45 days, 14 days for 45 days, and 10 days for 30 days.
Yeah, I agree. Those are very reasonable dates. You don't want to be too short. Have any of you put in 5 days for an inspection? It's okay if you have, I'm just curious.
Yeah, I have, if it's a cash offer and if we're competing.
How about 1 day?
Yeah, I've done that too.
How about no inspection?
Yes, I've done that too.
Yeah, and it's not that there is one right answer. The answer is not what we put in. The answer is what the client wants us to put in, right? As long as we have those conversations with them to say, you know, I really don't recommend you waive these things, but if you are insistent and you feel comfortable moving forward, that's okay, we can do that. And then have them sign whether it's a specific waiver or the generic waiver. And then in the email say, you know, here's the contract, you know, per our discussion, you're waiving these things and you're okay with it. It doesn't have to be a long, drawn out paragraph. It just has to be a couple sentences so that if later on the client comes back and says, I didn't know this, why didn't you tell me? You could say, we did have this conversation. You might not recall, but, and then you have something to pull up. So again, in here, in section J1, again, it's not just a physical inspection. There is an opportunity to do a physical inspection, but they also talk about the disclosures in paragraph I6. And then in section I, they also talk about, you know, later discovered information. And part of that later discovered information could actually fall within the J1 period. And that's where you have to understand, like, is this something that I cancel off of J1? Or is this something that I can utilize later under section I? So if I go back up here, we talk about general disclosures, right? Your J1, you have an opportunity during the J1 period to make sure that if any of these issues are concerns to your client, or even really anything else, it could be, so what could be something that's not attached to the property, but could be a material issue to a client that they would cancel off of the J1 period?
Maybe like a beach right of access.
Yeah, absolutely. Noisy neighbors, road noise, length of drive or commute, perhaps even a school district, right, if it's important to a parent. All of these things here that are not physically attached to a property are still material to a client, right? I mean, they could be driving only to the property on the weekends and not knowing how it's like during the weekday with their commute. They could be only coming during the weekday and not knowing the lifestyle of the community where your neighbor across the street like mine, who I did not know, likes to have parties every weekend and they're really loud. So these are some of those unexpected things, right? Because when I purchased my home, nobody was home. Everybody was at work. After we moved in, I found out that the neighbor across the street, they love to party, hey. And one of the other guys has a dirt bike and he would go up and down the street all day. And at first it kind of bothered me, but as we've gotten older, it's gotten a little more quiet. So it's not so bad now. And I think, you know, that's just some of the things, right, that you may not expect. Another one was an agent was helping a client who lived out in the Kalama, I don't know if it was quite Kalama Valley, I think it was closer to Hawaii Kai side of Oahu. And it was right next to the school. And they went there just to do their commute and see what the neighborhood was like in the evening, only to find out that apparently on the weekends, on the evening, there were some kids that were notorious for going into the parking lot late at night and doing like drifting or whatever they do, right? And making all kinds of ruckus. And when the buyer asked the seller about it, what do you think the seller said? Just throw a guess out there. This property was right next to the school parking lot.
No, they never did that before.
Yeah, I mean, it was like, oh, it was actually the opposite. It was like, oh yeah, we do that on the weekends. But it wasn't something that the sellers thought was an issue because it wasn't an issue to them. To them, it was not a noise issue. So there might be some things that the seller really doesn't know about, or the seller doesn't remember because it happened so long ago, or the seller isn't bothered by it. So they don't think it's important to disclose it to a potential buyer who might be bothered by something. So what we're saying is that make sure that the client is familiar not only with the property, but the community. So if you have information about a community, is that something that you as a buyer or seller's agent need to share?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And we're, yeah,
Is
sorry.
going back to that dirt fight example. So if that buyer cancels based on that, the next seller's disclosure should include that statement, right?
I would say so if you represent the seller, yeah. You know, because what you do want is that person not to be home doing dirt biking, you know, when the person's visiting and saying, I didn't know you had this person doing this kind of activity. I mean, to me, that's kind of a gray area too, right? It's a little bit gray, but it could be a matter to always, you know, disclose. Because to me, it was only a weekend thing, didn't really bother me. But to somebody else, it might be, you know, a huge issue to them. So it's always good to know like who your clients are and what's concerning to them. Do you mind an area that's very active, or do you look for an area that's quiet and you know, a little bit more tame? Or do you like an area that has a lot of community action? You know, some people like that. You know, I've been in, you know, when I was at Gentry Homes, there was one cul-de-sac where all the homeowners came to me one day and said, hey, you know what's great about our cul-de-sac? We all love to party. And I'm like, what do you guys? Because I didn't know what their lifestyle was, right? But just by chance, they loved having that community event type of thing where they'd all get together and have, you know, Saturday barbecues in the cul-de-sac. And good for them. But if you're at that house on the cul-de-sac and you didn't like that, you know, understand cul-de-sacs are areas where people do tend to congregate. Would you folks agree?
Yes.
Yeah, right, because it's kind of a safe place, right? At the end of a cul-de-sac. So pluses and minuses, you know, for some it's a benefit, for some it's not. So just remember your J1 does also include things outside the physical property, but we tend to think of J1 as being only the physical part because that's what it usually focuses on. But again, have your client understand that they need to look at everything that is concerning the property, that's physical or even the intangible, but it could be something that affects them. So we tend to talk about J1, and under this section, I'm going to skip up to real quick, section C. Okay, additional deposit. When you're looking here in section C, keyboard got stuck. Sorry, that was my keyboard, it got stuck. When you look at section C, and it says additional deposit paid into escrow by, what do you normally put in there? What is the due date that you normally see in in this section.
We usually put 2 days after J1 approval.
Yeah, and Margaret, why would you say 2 days of J1 deadline? Is it J1 deadline? J1 approval? Is it
2
deadline
days
or
after approval,
okay? And why 2 days?
just so that our clients have enough time.
Is it 2 calendar days or 2 business days?
We just put 2 days.
So, I mean, I don't have any particular preference, by the way. Some people are real sticklers, right? I actually prefer, just FYI, if I were to put something in there, I would say into escrow by 2 business days of J1 deadline or J1 expiration or something to that effect. Some people say satisfaction, some people say approval. And I'm going to key in on another thing here. So if we say into J1 deadline, which is whatever time frame you have in here, what it says here is the obligation, the obligation of the buyer to purchase the property is contingent upon the buyer's approval of inspection and review of all matters described in paragraph 1, I6, within so many days of after the acceptance date. So you have to do your physical inspection and review of anything else that was noted under I6. What happens if the buyer does not approve, but they did not cancel or terminate the contract within the J1 deadline? What happens?
It's considered to be accepted by default then.
So again, we want to be careful when we say approved, accepted, satisfied, right? Because does the buyer have to be satisfied? Does the buyer have to approve of anything and still be locked into a contract?
Well, it's no longer a contingency. They've waived J1 as a contingency.
Absolutely. Absolutely. When you look at the contract, you might see words that say satisfaction, approval, all of those things. But at the end of the day, really what it comes down to is your termination provision. Does a party have a right to terminate and the contract and remove themselves from any obligations, or have they waived their right to terminate and no longer can cancel based upon that specific provision? Because you can have a buyer that doesn't cancel and terminate the contract, doesn't mean they're happy with it, and they'll come back later and say something about it. So has any of that happened to you folks? And by the way, it's not uncommon. So if it has, don't feel like you're the only one. It's actually not uncommon at all to have a buyer say everything is okay, and then later down the line, just before closing, typically they don't want to pursue the property for whatever reason, and now they're looking for a way out. Have you folks ever encountered that?
Yes.
Thanks, Kurt, for being so open. Yeah, it happens, right? It's not you. It's not, maybe it's just not even the property. The property is fine from a reasonable person's perspective, but for whatever reason, the buyer just wishes not to pursue it anymore. And they turn to you and say, oh no, I want to get out. How do I get out? So part of that is say, well, we didn't cancel off of J1. And depending how far along you are into the contract, you may be able to cancel off of other provisions. But this is pretty much your most general area of which a buyer can just say, I'm not okay with the property and walk away. Once you go beyond the J1, it becomes a little bit more difficult, but you still have some rights. You know, you have rights under Section I, you have rights under M1, you have, you know, any other inspections that might come into play that require an update to the disclosure statement, and that's an out. There's quite a bit of out for the buyer. How many of you have done the homework of going through the contract page by page and highlighting each section of the termination provision? Margaret, I know you've been in this, you've done the practice, right?
Yes,
And it's important, right, Margaret, to know what termination provision applies.
that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Because if you don't know the termination provision, you won't be able to give your clients the proper guidance. So go through the section O and take a different color highlighter or pen for each section, section O, section, or I should say provision O1, O2, O3, and go through each other provision of the contract and highlight it. So in this case, under J1, it's O2, right? So they can cancel off of O2. And what is O2? And by the way, if you ever have a question, your answer is going to be in the contract. So here's your termination provision. Within a contingency period, right? So if you're wondering, like, what's the deadline? Well, in this case, the J1 is you have to terminate prior to the J1 deadline. And other than an amended seller's disclosure, what is the deadline for every contingency as per the contract? 1101A, my J1 expires today. How long do I have till I can cancel? So Margaret, I saw that you were opening up your mic. I apologize for interrupting.
Oh no, I was going to ask you to clarify your question. But I guess, you know, if J1 expires, then we look for other contingencies.
So every contingency of the contract expires at 11:59 p.m. unless otherwise noted within the contract. So let's say deadline to accept the offer. If you put in some sort of specific language that changes the deadline, or whether it's for all or specific, all contracts, unless otherwise noted in, all deadlines, unless otherwise noted in the contract, expire at 11:59 p.m. So if you Hawaii time. Thank you.
Right.
Yes, very good clarification. Hawaii time. So make sure that you have these conversations with the client. Say, as soon as the clock strikes midnight, you know, Cinderella goes back from being that, you know, princess into Cinderella, and the pumpkin is no longer a carriage, and the horses go back to being mice, right? It's 12 o'clock midnight when the clock strikes. So you have to make sure that everything is either has been sent in, if it needs to be sent in, or if a cancellation needs to be done, that it is sent in and delivered to the other party no later than 11:59 p.m. Because otherwise, your client will have waived their rights. And under J1, if you look at the bold, it even says that, right? Right here. If the buyer fails to terminate, the buyer will have waived the contingency. So make sure that the client understands that, you know, this is one of the most important areas for them to look at. they should not be waiting to the last minute to do their inspection. You should be having a conversation with them at the very beginning when you're working with them. Say, when is the best time for you guys to actually be able to meet at a property to do your inspection? Can you take time off of work? Things like that, because you want to make sure that whatever timeline is in here makes sense. If a buyer says, I need to get I need to get this offer accepted, so let's just put in 5 days for home inspection. Well, let's say that you get an acceptance on a Sunday, and you have 5 days now to do your inspection, and the client says, I'm not available during the week. I can only do an inspection on the weekend. What kind of problem are you going to now encounter?
You gotta hope that the inspector is available and you can ask for an extension.
So let's say inspector is available, but listing agent says, no, we have another backup offer, so we're not going to give you an extension on the J1 period. So you have to have everything done by Friday, 11:59 p.m. And buyer says, there's no way, I can't do it. I can't meet the inspector.
Do a video, FaceTime.
So yeah, you can do that. Make sure again you have the conversation. But would it have been helpful to have this conversation before you folks submitted the offer and maybe changed it from 5 days to 7 days?
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Just like what Peter said, he gives his clients their recommendations, right, on certain time frames. So don't put in arbitrary numbers. Make sure that the numbers that you have are based upon the client, the specific client. A lot of agents will use templates where they just auto-populate. And then when you ask them, why did you put that number in there? They go, I don't know, I was always told to put that number in there. And I go, okay, but did anybody explain to you why that number was in there? Well, no, we were just told to put that number in there. So understand that there is a reason why numbers become kind of set in our industry. It becomes common practice, but it isn't common law. So common practice just means we do things because we're so used to it. It's customary. We see it happen a lot. Common law is where it becomes so accustomed to everybody doing it that it's almost lawful, right? It's almost like something that's set. So nothing in the contract is set. This contract lives and breathes. From the day it's signed as an offer up to the day that the property records. Always tell your client, this is not set. Even if we put dates in here, anything can happen. A lot of these contingencies, the dates are going to change, and our timelines will be impacted depending on when something is delivered, right? So you have so many days to deliver an item. You have so many days to review an item. All of these things will change. So make sure you have those conversations with your client, because what we do see quite often is where you have these agents who are not having the proper conversations. Lo and behold, like Elaine said, you have inspectors who just are not able to accommodate, or maybe the seller will not accommodate, and maybe the buyer just can't make it. And now you as an agent are being put into a precarious position, right? Of having to somehow be there for the eyes, but make sure you document. Make sure you document that the buyer understands that the agent is not replacing them. Now, alternative to an agent being there on behalf of the buyer, who else could the buyer bring in?
Family member or a contractor would be good.
Yeah, absolutely. Someone that they trust to be an agent for them, and not from a licensing perspective, but just from an accommodation perspective. It could be a contractor. It could be a trusted family member who is, especially if it's someone who's going to be, in the home or is involved in the transaction. It could be, anyone that they trust. You are there too, but you're not there and you're not everywhere. So you want to be able to keep that arm's length distance and say, do you have somebody to represent you if you are unable to attend an inspection?
Question.
Yes.
So in terms of being upfront in the presentation, or to be clear, J3 is not a termination provision unless it's by mutual agreement. Comes a termination provision, and I'm thinking if there was a substantial change in the condition property from J1. Is that a correct way to present it?
Yes. Yes. Has anybody told J3 is a way to get out of the contract?
Very rarely, but yeah, like Kurt said, if something major were to happen, then that could be a way out. Like let's say if that flooded, then either if the time frame won't work for the buyer anymore, then buyer could cancel, or if the damage, buyer and seller would not be able to agree on how to repair or handle the damages.
Would you actually be canceling off of J3, or would you be canceling off of another provision?
Well, I think when it does actually happen, like in a flood, let's say there's a leak in pipe and it causes flood and substantial damage, it could really be a way out. The buyer could say, I don't want it anymore. There's too much work involved. I'm not going to handle it. And I don't want to wait for the repair. I need to move to a house. So I think buyer could cancel.
Okay. So you are the buyer and I'm the seller, and you're going to send me a termination provision. What provision would you be canceling off of? Would it be J3?
Oh, I would be canceling on closing date. And of course, I guess everybody knows already that J3 is part of the reason. So now we can't close on time. So I'll use F2 to cancel.
Okay. So here's what.
I'd like to shot. Would amended seller's disclosure be a cleaner?
Yeah. Thank you for looking at the screen too.
Oh, I can't see the screen. Actually, that's a question I have. I don't know how I can actually just view the screen on it.
Yeah, perfect. Yes, absolutely. And thank you, Kurt. This is exactly where I was going. J3 in and of itself is not the cancellation provision, but can an event that occurs because of J3 or is discovered because of J3 be the catalyst? Yeah, absolutely. But what it would fall under is the amended disclosure. So Margaret, let's say you and your client go into the property for the walkthrough and you realize, oh my gosh, there's a huge leak in here and there's all this damage. And even if the seller said, I'm willing to fix it, the buyer's concerned now, right? The buyer says, what's going on? And the buyer says, I want an amendment to the SRPDS. If you look at section I2, and when I say, again, everything is 11:59 p.m. unless it's in the contract, take a look at this last sentence where it says, discovery of a non-disclosure or inaccuracy in any event by, so this is the seller. The seller has to provide an amended disclosure no later than 12 noon of the last business day prior to the recorded sale of the property. So if the seller is made aware of something, they have to provide it to you no later than 12 noon prior business days. If the buyer discovers something, that falls under I4, right? And we've had like a 4-week discussion on section I, and this is I4 is pretty powerful, right? you go back and say, look, we've discovered this and we're canceling off of section I-4. So anything that's discovered that's different and material fact to the buyer, you would say, during our J3, it was discovered this, or that, and therefore buyer is canceling under I-4, or buyer is asking for seller disclosure, because we don't know what the situation is, right? So you can utilize those things, but absolutely at the same time, you will now be looking at a change in the closing date. Whether that is or isn't an ability to terminate depends on a bigger picture, right? Depends on what the issue is and what's being agreed upon. And that's why the contract lives and breathes. You never know what's going to happen. And anytime there's an issue that opens up an opportunity for a conversation, it opens up an opportunity for renegotiation. Would you all agree to that?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So understanding the contract allows you to be more aware of your strategies. You know, how do we handle this situation? How can a buyer get out if they're not comfortable with it? Do you think that there are buyers who ended up closing on a home because their agent didn't understand the rights that the buyer had to cancel at the end?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, what happens afterwards when a buyer is that unhappy that they ended up buying a home that they feel like they shouldn't have had to buy?
Seeking legal advice.
Yes, that's right. They seek legal counsel. And whether you, as an agent, are representing the buyer or seller, what do you think attorneys do when they have a claim?
Well, they look at the contract that the buyer had a defense that wasn't advised. They weren't advised of a cancellation.
Yeah.
Within the contract.
And let's say the seller's agent knew that there was an issue, like, oh, okay, so there's a leak, and for whatever reason didn't pass it on to the seller. That's an issue too, right? You know, the listing agent might be like, well, is it an issue for you? No, okay. Then I'm not going to move forward. I'm going to leave it up to the buyer to decide what they want to do. It's a wide net. Attorneys don't throw one line at a time. They're going to throw out a huge wide net, big or small. They're going to try to catch as many fish as possible. So from a listing agent perspective, if you're not there at the walkthrough, what should you do to protect yourself and the seller regarding the J3?
Take video, one thing.
Yeah, video is absolutely. Video is great. What else could you do? Could you get a J3 form signed saying that the buyer is satisfied?
Oh, yes, that's pretty standard.
Yeah, absolutely. Could you go into the property before it closes and just to make sure that nothing is wrong, out of place, at least visually?
Oh, definitely. And it sounds like, Jennifer, then, you know, I never really realized, but it is, I guess, good practice to try and always be there at the final walkthrough because of this, just in case, you know.
Yeah, you don't have to be, but if you can, have somebody there just to make sure that everything is okay. And if there are any concerns, that you as a listing agent can say, okay, this is a concern. I'm going to write a note about it, but I need you, buyer's agent, to send me something formal in writing as well. You know, ask them to participate in documenting their concerns. Because again, a delay in closing for a few days or even a cancellation is far easier and less expensive than a lawsuit.
Because I am now thinking, you know, but this, amended disclosure, I mean, how small or how big does this material in fact need to be? Say they were moving the furniture and scratched the floor, could they cancel because of that? You know, they were looking for an out, say.
Well, what do you folks think? It's a cosmetic scratch. It's not a structural issue. Could a buyer cancel?
Not.
So Margaret says no. Anybody else? I would agree with Margaret. It's not, I mean, go back to the definition, right? Is it something that would be negatively and affect the value of a property to a reasonable person? Now, could the buyer ask to be compensated? Yeah. You know, by the way, nicks and scratches happen all the time. The seller should be prepared that, you know, buyer could come back. Agents will often throw money at it just to say, hey, here's some money and get it fixed. Those are usually the most common types of cure. But I mean, if it's a huge issue, I mean, where it's detrimental to the value of the property, then yeah. But it could absolutely bring up that conversation, right? Hey, you know, I moved in, and what's all this stuff? You know, could even happen after closing. But what does the contract say once the buyer closes on a property?
The buyer takes the property as is.
That's right. The buyer takes the property as is. So they're going to have to show burden of proof, right? That the damage was not there prior to. And you as a listing agent can show, if you have photos, know the damage was there or the scratch was there before we even put it on the market. And that's part of the hard thing too, when you go into a property that has furnishing in it, right? So set your clients up for expectations, which is be prepared that, you know, when they move the property out of the home, you might see some dings and nicks. It happens. So if you see something, let me know, and, you know, but just understand that these things happen. When you set your clients up for certain expectations, it's not a big deal if the issue comes up. It's when you don't prepare them that it becomes a big deal. Would you all agree?
Yes. So another thing that I see kind of come up, and it seems like it's not very clear, is, you know, when you see there's a bunch of stuff on the walls, and you know that's going to be removed, and the question becomes, should the seller patch up, or is that on the buyer? And should you put something in writing? What do people normally do? Because I see that, you know, kind of become a question. Usually people don't make a big deal of it, but I'm assuming one day someone might.
Are you saying like a damage during escrow?
Well, you know, because when they first see the property, and then, you know, they go on a final walkthrough and there's holes everywhere because the pictures were removed, or maybe some decorative shelving were removed. So whose responsibility is to patch the holes up?
What does the audience think? What do you folks think?
The seller wants a happy buyer. And if they can patch it up, that would be best.
I think the buyer should put that in writing at J1, that the final walkthrough, those would be patched.
Yeah, I like when things are like very clear on both sides from the beginning. So I'm definitely, I just don't want to look like an extra type of agent, where like, what's wrong with this one?
Let me go through here. I have to ask you something. How many of you put the as-is addendum on your contract?
All the time.
Oh, yeah, I'm trying to see if I have one in front of me. So let me go into here. But what does the as-is addendum say?
Let's see.
I might have to go into my zip form real quick. The as-is says that the buyer accepts the property as is, right? So if there were dings and nicks and all this other stuff prior to, the buyer has to understand that they can't have a certain expectation that anything is going to be repaired. That they accept what they see and they accept what they don't see, what they're aware of and what they're not aware of. And it says in the first paragraph that, in fact, it might be even the first sentence, that the as-is addendum is material to the seller accepting the offer. So the as-is addendum is intended not to just put it in there arbitrarily as well. We have a lot of conversations with clients that say, hey, this is really just about the big issues. Actually, it's not. It's about every single issue, big or small. But the way that it's been treated, or even since I started, over 20 years ago, was that, oh, you just don't Mickey Mouse over the small stuff. But the big stuff you can. Because in essence, you are using what on the big stuff to renegotiate. What section of the contract are you actually using to renegotiate if there's anything big that is discovered later on?
J1? Oh, later on.
Yeah, J1 is absolutely right, J1, right? But what in J1 are you really thinking is really what's important in J1? Newly discovered information, right? You could be looking at section I, because your J1 really is just whatever you discover, you either take it or you leave it. You're not you can either cancel or not. But in addition, and that's not to be used as a negotiation tool. So if you're a buyer and you submit an as-is, could the listing, and you want to now negotiate repairs or remedies or concessions, could the listing agent turn around and say, we're not negotiating anything. You submitted an as-is addendum. You either cancel or you move forward. Could a listing agent?
Yeah, they can do that for sure. Or they can not even respond anything and let it expire.
Yeah, they could. It's not really,
Yeah, that's not nice, but
yeah, but they could. They could just say, no, we're not entertaining this. You submitted an as-is. You think that there are agents who've actually said that to listing agents who've said that to buyer's agents?
yes.
Yes, quite often.
Yeah, right?
Especially in this market, of course.
Yeah. So you set the client up for expectation, but just like how Kurt suggested, in your as-is, there is a section at the bottom that says special terms. Could you put exceptions in there?
I like that idea.
What we used to do a lot was you see in the contract all appliances to be in proper working condition consistent with age, or just, or it could be just proper working condition. And by the way, are those two very different things? Consistent with age, the proper working condition, consistent with age, or just proper working condition? Do you think those are the same or different?
different. Sometimes things are out of warranty too, or, so.
Yeah. When people don't look at the words and think about how important are words, like the Oxford comma. A comma is extremely important because it says, is this included with the rest of the sentence or the provision, or is it separate? Is it attached, or is it a clarification? So words can be very important. And if you say proper working condition, you as a buyer can go to the seller and say, this is not proper working condition. You gotta do everything to fix it, and so that it is in proper working condition. If you say proper working condition consistent with age, then the expectation is, hey, it works, but it's not great because it's old, but it works. And so that might be enough for a buyer, and that might be enough for a seller. So if a buyer comes back and says, proper working condition, if you saw that, and what would you put in, or what would you do as a seller's agent?
Consistent with age. Had that.
Right. You could be somewhat amenable and say, yeah, it's a working condition, but consistent with age. Same thing with electrical, same thing with plumbing, same thing with anything else. It's not just appliances, right? Okay, the hot water heater works, but not great. My stove works, but only goes up to 350. So, not great. The refrigerator works, but, the ice maker doesn't because, it doesn't work. So, by the way, do you think an ice maker is important?
Yeah, especially in EVA.
Right.
Inside joke for being really mad. Let me tell you, some of the smallest, most minute things become some of the biggest issues. So make sure when you're going through the property with your seller, or you're going through the property with the client, take a look at things that they're going to use on an everyday basis. Because most people don't think about water pressure. They don't think about ice makers. They don't think about the water heater. They're too much, they're distracted by other things, right? And they just assume everything's going to work great. And they only when they move in or later on do they find out that the ceiling fan is wobbly or makes a funny sound, or the ice maker doesn't work, or the water pressure isn't that great, or whatever. So the main thing that we're trying to say is every opportunity that you have to listen to your client, listen, observe, watch, see what they touch. By the way, these are all sales techniques too, that we'll go over in a different class. When you observe somebody, you are going to get a lot of answers, what's important to them. And I can tell you this real quick. I know we're running a few minutes after, but if you're in a home with a client, watch how they engage with the home. Because a client who's really interested, even if you're a listing agent and you're sitting in an open house, they're gonna touch things, right? They're gonna sit down, they're gonna look around, they're gonna be a little bit more engaged with the home. And that's when you know if what's important to somebody or if they're interested in the property. I would do that a lot when I was a listing agent. I would actually, and as a buyer's agent, but I was a listing agent, I would see who sits in the home, who's sitting down. If they're sitting down, they're going to buy a house. They're going to buy it. They're going to put an offer in, even if I don't represent them. And I'm going to know how much I need to negotiate or push because I've observed them in the home. So observation and body language is huge, but listen to what people say because these are the areas that are going to probably be the biggest issues of concern if something isn't quite right. So thank you again, everyone, for being here. I love the participation. And now you can see why it takes forever to go through the contract, right? Because we talk about things. And we haven't even finished, really, J1 or J2. We're still touching on that. and getting into J3. So for the next class, we'll go into the J3 and J4. And if you have any questions or topics that you want to talk about, share them. It can be before we start. It can be, again, like we do ad hoc here, kind of just impromptu. And it could be, before the class starts as well. So thank you, Margaret, for bringing your team here. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you, Jan.
And I hope you folks will join us again in the future and continue to be part of the class.
Thank
So
you.
the next one is the 2 weeks from now, right? But it's on a Thursday.